Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for coming. It's been a good experience curating this exhibition, thanks to Carl Walters being such a terrific artist, such a terrific and little-known artist. So many people are reacting with pleasure to encounter his work for the first time. And it was a good experience, too, because I worked with a really good team here, including Sarah Pasty, Ursula Morgan, the exhibition coordinator, Bob, who did a lot of the installation, Joel Rosenkrantz helped with the installation, and several other people participated as well. So today we organized a short symposium with presentations relating to Carl Walters and his work. The catalog is on the way. It's still not here yet, but it should be available next week, with essays by myself and by Adrian Spinozzi, who's a ceramics curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, both about Carl Walters. Today we're going to have Martin Eidelberg speak about the tradition of ceramic sculpture to kind of contextualize Carl Walters. I'll introduce everybody individually very quickly, but just to give you a table of contents, William Rhodes is going to speak about Carl Walters and his residence in the Maverick colony in Woodstock. Caroline Hanna is going to speak about Henry Varnum Poor, a major contemporary ceramic artist and sculptor, major contemporary of Walters, and Tom Folk is going to speak about Weiland Gregory, who is another major contemporary ceramic sculptor of Walters, to contextualize his work further, and then I'll take you quickly through the exhibition. So first, Martin Eidelberg is Professor Emeritus of Art History at Rutgers University and a renowned expert about American sculpture. American ceramics.
So, a few months ago when Adrian Spinozzi and I were talking, because we were working on another project about ceramics, we had a long discussion about the importance of ceramics and ceramic sculpture in the 1930s, which she thought was really very, very, very new. And I agreed. But then I kept saying, well, it's been around for a long time. It really has. And so that's what I really want to talk about today, which is the tradition of ceramic sculpture. I didn't notice it, but Carl Walters, Weiland Gregory, and now Henry Varnum Poor flashed on your screen. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about the things that happened before them. And it really is impossible to talk in 15 minutes. It's like trying to talk in haikus, 17 syllables and it's over, and it just doesn't fit the English language. So how far back does the tradition of ceramic sculpture go? Well, 29,000 BC. Now I have to do the rest in 15 minutes. The interesting thing is that this little figurine, it's only about 4.5 inches high, found in what nowadays is the Czech Republic, is probably the oldest ceramic sculpture known. So in other words, ceramic sculpture goes back as far as ceramics itself. What was it made for? It might have been, probably was a fertility goddess or something like that. The interesting thing is that there's the fingerprints of a very young girl in the clay. But of course, a girl at 15 could well have been thinking about fertility. It might have been the mother already of several children back in 29,000 BC. The other things that were made in those prehistoric Neolithic and Paleolithic times were sculptures of animals. Just, like Lascaux, they paint animals, they sculpt animals, perhaps also concerned with the fertility of their herds or in terms of hunting. Now, zooming ahead about 25,000 years. I'm going to be fast. In the Near East, there arose a tradition, or there continued a tradition, of ceramic sculpture. This is one from Western Iran. I don't know myself because Wikipedia didn't help me on this. It's sometime between 10,000 and 4,000 BC. And it's really quite charming, isn't it? The patterning of it, it's skillful. And it's about 2 feet tall. We're talking about substantial ceramic sculpture. And certainly that tradition has remained a very firm tradition. When we were walking through before, Caroline and Tom, one of them said something about a lot of animals. Well, in fact, animals have become one of the main themes of ceramic sculpture. Okay, put on your blinders. We're going to jump forward to about 500 BC. And I've jumped past Egypt, which had a tradition. I'm jumping by Greece, which has a tradition. But everybody knows these Etruscan sculptures, full-size, life-size ceramic figures that adorn the covers of sarcophagi. And of course, anything that was made for burial tends to be preserved, and those things which are made for, for domestic use. Also from temples, you have these full-standing, full-height figures that were in the pediments, and really Etruria had more of a ceramic than a stone sculpture tradition. Some of you may remember, if you're old enough, like me, there were two wonderful Etruscan warriors in the Metropolitan Museum, full-standing figures which turned out to be fake, but they were still wonderful. Now, in these politically sensitive days, I don't want to be accused of being Eurocentric, though I am. That's really my interest. So I'm going to jump for one moment to China. And this is going to be basically very little bit, but it's a token, but an important token. And you may remember the excitement that occurred in 1974 in northwestern China when they were doing excavations of the tomb of what was supposedly the first emperor of China, and discovered these full-size Chinese warriors and horses. And there weren't 10 or 20, but thousands of them. Quite extraordinary, and some of them have toured in the United States, and some of you may have even seen them. I have to admit, I didn't go. But they're very sophisticated, they're portraitistic, they're skillful. Remember, they're life-size. And that's quite a feat to fire life-size figures. Imagine how big the kiln has to be. And sometimes it's easier to understand they're being life-size if you see them compared to famous people that you know. And I had one of a Republican, but I decided, no, I would do it safely this way. You're welcome. Anyhow, what these, of course, suggest, and these aren't that old, they're from 200 BC, is a long-standing tradition behind them. I'm just making this one gesture to remind you that there is an Eastern tradition. And it's a tradition which we know very well, showing you a Tang sculpture of a horse and this of a rather portly court lady. And it doesn't really matter whether it's really Tang Dynasty or whether it's 1925 dynasty, whether it's old or new, for ceramists. And if you go upstairs, you'll see so many animals that look just like this on their little platforms. Picasso didn't necessarily have the best of African sculpture before him when he studied African sculpture, but he got the principles of it. And that's true for ceramic artists. They don't necessarily have to see the authentic work as long as they understand something of that sensibility. And for people like Carl Walters, who studied studiously in the Metropolitan Museum, where there are authentic examples, and then sometimes some that are not so authentic that have gotten in by mistake, they understood and were deeply influenced by it. Now, I have to run forward. Time is a-running. So I come up to the Italian Renaissance. And I promised Tom Folk I wouldn't talk about Luca della Robbia, so I won't. He's going to mention it. But once again, we're reminded that in the West, there was a very steady ceramic tradition. And it could be figurative. It often was. It could function as votive pieces. It could be adornments to walls. And it had style. It corresponded to what we see in painting and sculpture of the time. And I want to remind everybody once again, because you may not be ceramic historians or even interested in the decorative arts as a branch of art history. And there is a kind of hierarchy. According to some people, Architecture is at the top, the father of the arts. Then there's painting, then there's sculpture, and down below is the decorative arts, often called the minor arts. But in fact, the minor arts were often major arts, and that what they were doing in the decorative arts almost always corresponds to what they were doing in the fine arts. And very often, fine artists and decorative artists belong to the same groups and interchanged ideas. This is a plug for the so-called decorative arts. Moving along to the 17th century. You notice this is a fast trip. Here we have Bernini. And I think everybody knows Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, which is such a dramatic, moving work, particularly at one point in the afternoon when the sunlight comes down, that it could even make me turn Roman Catholic. Now, Bernini was essentially a sculptor in stone, but increasingly in the later Renaissance, and certainly in the Baroque period, stone sculptors worked first in clay and made these models, or if you want to, you can use the Italian bozzetto, or in the plural, bozzetti. And they were really adept, firing medium and large-scale sculpture. This is what it is. This control drawer keeps rolling back. And in the 18th century, these clay modelli became actually finished works. I'm showing you two works by Claude Young. At the left is the nymph and satyr, and some of you may have studied, with Jansen or Gardner, one of those standard textbooks which always show the statue. It's a small-scale sculpture. It's only about this big. It's meant for a salon. It's a really very naughty work if you look at it in terms of where the nymph is in relation to the satyr, and you remember what satyrs are famous for. It's a kind of President Trump-like idea. It's not funny, actually. But what we find here with Claude Young is that association of the fine arts and clay with domestic interior decoration. That's a terribly important idea. And of course, in the 18th century, you also have, finally, the growth, or the invention of and growth of, Meissen and porcelain. That's where it was first discovered, and then you gradually see it coming through Germany, then into France, and then ultimately into England. Now, the porcelain material per se is clay. It's a specialized kind of clay, and of course, it continued as well the tradition of small-scale sculpture. Here we have something from the Commedia dell'arte of the sort of funny but maybe a little nefarious Pantaloon charming the young Columbine. It could be all sorts of other subjects. And what were they? Well, of course, animals were a very popular one. And sometimes they could even be like little stage sets, like some of the stage sets that are upstairs. This is one in which at the center you see Venus and Mars, and coming around the corner is Jupiter. And I wasn't planning to show this, but I saw it and I said, oh my God, there's Henry Varnum Poor, there's Carl Walters. Maybe it'll make someone smile. Hopefully the speakers. Now there are also, as opposed to the courtly realm, the expensive realm of Meissen, there's common earthenware. And the Staffordshire figures are very often like Meissen or other porcelain figures, but reduced to a more common kind of material and also a more common kind of idiom. And they're a little folksy or very folksy. I love the one at the right of that woman remonstrating with the man who's apparently drunk a little too much. It's called Ale Bench, and he's fallen off of it. It looks like she's going to knock him off of it even further. Or the little horse that's jumping over the fallen jockey. And what if I wrote under that Carl Walters or Henry Varnum Poor? It's almost believable. At least I could believe it. And I remember, and I hope Caroline won't yell at me for being wrong, that in the living room of Carl Henry Varnum Poor's living room, there was a Staffordshire figure or two. And I thought, oh, wouldn't that be good to show? But then I thought, not in 15 minutes. So now, skipping to the end of the 19th century, to Balzac. Balzac we think of as working in bronze or marble, and we forget that many of his models were first created in clay. Actually, at the left is a relatively realistic head of Balzac, which was a preliminary to his very famous statue at the right in bronze, but he also made much more expressionist ones. And sometimes he turned some of his small casts into clay, which was then glazed and sold. I mean, this was part of what he was doing. And the idea of an artist making ceramic sculpture was an idea which became, in the late 1890s and 1910s, an extremely popular idea, not only in France, but also in Germany. Jean Carriès, who was a potter, turned to ceramic sculpture. A very Japanese-like mask at the right, a head of a satyr the Japanese mask is at the left, head of a satyr at the right. And people who were non-ceramic workers, but who were sculptors, very often were encouraged to make sculptures that could be cast by potters and glazed. And this became a large tradition. Bernard Oetker, for example, made sculpture for Dauperat to fire. Ernst Barlach, who was working in Germany, the great expressionist, made sculpture that could be fired in both first stoneware and then in porcelain. And talk about funny, I mean, because upstairs so much of it is funny. Look at this wonderful toad. I mean, it's really, really, from my sense, comic. These ideas also spread to Austria, and I'm showing you some very chic black and white little putti representing the seasons done by Michael Pavolny, who taught at the Decorative Arts School there. And a lot of Americans in the 1920s studied at that same school, particularly the ceramic sculptors from Cleveland, which is in my next speech. Some of the sculptures that Pavolny made, like the little lady at the left, are only about 18 inches tall. But the figure at the right is this giant, probably 4 feet tall sculpture, which was made as architectural ornament for a famous, very chicly decorated bathhouse. And the ideas of Pavolny, because he was an important ceramic teacher in Vienna, continued into the Wiener Werkstätte. And here we're seeing 2 ceramic sculptures from the 1920s by Wally Wieseltier and Lottie Kalm. I don't know what the women at the right are doing. Actually, I do. They represent heavenly, she's pointing up, and earthly, she's naked or nude, love. And here again, these were extremely popular in the United States, not only in Vienna. The Wiener Werkstätte had a store in New York in the early 1920s, and then Rena Rosenthal in New York continued showing the Wiener Werkstätte work, and Susie Singer and Wally Wieseltier came to the United States in the 1920s. Wally Wieseltier was a good friend of one of the people you'll be hearing about in a few minutes, Weiland Gregory. And these are relatively small pieces. I show you another one. It is a bizarre Chinese-inspired one. It's a very strange subject. I don't know how she's managing to stand on those 2 little dogs. And this is fairly tall. This is 3 feet tall. So that's quite a scale. You know, one of the things that you'll see, not so much upstairs, but in the ceramic sculptures by the people, is that there was a great drive not only toward comic, but also to the monumental. And then the question is, how big does monumental look? So I wanted to show you. Oh, wow. Right, they're big. I didn't pick this one because it was the biggest. I picked it because it's owned by a friend of mine around the corner. So now, I've made it to 15 minutes, thank God. Okay, so here's the question. Were these early things important? Yes, because they were artists, and they did tend to look at what had gone before. Sometimes they denied it. Very often, some of them denied it. I remember a wonderfully funny visit to Weiland Gregory's house. And he had died, but his widow was there. And she told me in all seriousness that her husband had invented the term ceramic sculpture. Well, that's utter nonsense, which was what mostly she did speak. But whatever it was called, what I hope I've shown you is that from 39 or 29,000 BC to the present, there has been a very continuous and inspiring tradition. And if I had 30 minutes, I'd show you more. Bye.
Thank you, Martin. Our next speaker, many of you know because he's taught here for many years. He's emeritus now. It's William Rhodes, who's an architectural historian and who is an expert of architecture, especially of this region, which includes Woodstock, where Carl Walters lived and worked for most of his career.
Thank you, Tom. Tom Wolfe, by the way, provided me with a number of important images, photographs, and I thank him for that. Here we are looking at Carl Walters on the right, standing at his ceramic studio on the Maverick near Woodstock. Walters built and doubtless designed the stone-walled, arched studio or shop building soon after his arrival at the Maverick in 1922. The building was supported by Harvey White, the founder of the Maverick colony, in 1905. Harvey White wrote that he supported Carl Walters in constructing this shop and also supported Walters by providing a house in which he, Walters, and his wife, Helen, could both live and display the ceramics. Incidentally, in this photo, you may see a couple of mildly interesting details. Carl Walters going against Harvey White's general dislike of automobiles on the right, and also Carl Walters fitting in with the Woodstock Maverick idea of harmony with nature by preserving that tree and building around the tree. Harvey White, the founder of the Maverick colony in 1905, was a dreamer, a writer, an idealist, and occupied a house at the Maverick, a farmhouse, similar to what we see in this advertising print for a novel by Harvey White from the 1910s. So in the novel, the subject occupies a home of the sort that Harvey White dreamed of occupying and in fact did occupy. This is Arnold Blanche's portrait of Harvey White, dreaming, reclining, writing at Harvey White's home, which was called Bear Camp, and which survives today, although somewhat altered externally. At any rate, Harvey White's preference architecturally was for simplicity, a kind of hand craftsmanship, generally within the arts and crafts mode. Harvey White had been educated at Harvard, and he had architectural ideas and ambitions. Harvey White's greatest architectural accomplishment was the concert hall at the Maverick from the 1910s. And among other things, we might note that the concert hall is nestled into the forest as the Walters studio was nestled into the forest at the Maverick. Harvey White established an art colony, art writers, musicians colony at the Maverick with several dozen cottages. This is one of the more substantial from the 1920s, occupied by Harry Gottlieb, a painter, printmaker, and by Eugene Spiker, a sculptor and printmaker. This is a more typical example of a cottage on the Maverick. Rustic, homemade, kind of slapdash, not very carefully planned, not really intended to last forever, although perhaps that chimney will last forever. There aren't very many good, in fact, maybe no good photos of Carl Walter's home, which was provided for him by Harvey White at the Maverick. This is perhaps the best photo of Carl Walter's house at the, am I making that noise?
I don't know how. I'm gonna turn this down a little. Keep talking, it's okay.
It's characteristic of a Maverick cottage in its rusticity. The walls here of bark-covered slabs, the trellis composed of rustic posts. Somewhat larger building than I think was typical of the Maverick cottages, perhaps in part because Harvey White hoped that Walters would be able to display and sell his ceramics from this building. A slightly different view of the Walters shop or studio, with the stone walls very un-Harvey White, very much more sophisticated, a kind of old world quality to it. And also take note of the cupola with the bell on top. Carl Walters shared with Harvey White a certain eccentricity, a certain desire for novelty. And the bell, by 1933, was rigged up electrically so that it would ring regularly on the hours. Walters was a tinkerer, something of a mechanic, something of an inventor. When he built his shop, he also built his kiln very near the open porch of the shop. So here in a famous image, we see Walters stoking the fire of his kiln with long branches and a very substantial chimney behind. A work of architecture, perhaps. The kiln is recorded in this well-known lithograph by Eugene Spiker, whose home we have looked at recently. This is from about 1932, shows Walters at work at his kiln, but Walters' sculptures tend to be witty and amusing, and you see that his work is also his play, that he has a party going on at night in the hours while the firing proceeds. And I believe Tom has identified the standing figure at the left as Harvey White. The kiln came to be disused after Walter's death in the 50s, and the kiln, I suppose, became a certain kind of shrine in Woodstock, in the Woodstock area. Carl Fortas, a well-known Woodstock painter, did at least 2 paintings of the decrepit, decaying Walters kiln. A number of the artists who lived on Harvey White's Maverick found the very simple, well, let's just say they had outhouses. found these houses to be too simple, too without comfort. And so they departed the Maverick. A couple named Wendell and Jane Jones, whose home was at or near where Carl Walter's home was located on the Maverick. Wendell and Jane Jones in the 30s occupied a simple Maverick Cottage. But Jane Jones, perhaps especially, brought up in a substantial middle-class home, didn't much want to spend her whole life in the austerity of the Maverick. So they built in 1939 this two-story Colonial Revival house off the Maverick. Harvey White hated White. He hated the Colonial Revival. You would move out of the Maverick if you wanted a house like this. Eugene Spiker, like Walters, had been trained under Robert Henry. And this is Spiker's home in Woodstock, a home which by the 1930s had taken on this Colonial Revival aspect, thanks to the work of the area's leading Colonial Revival architectural firm of Teller and Halverson. Carl Walters himself came under the spell of Teller and Halverson's Colonial Revival. So here we see Teller and Halverson plans from 1931 for Carl Walters' home, which we can be sure was not to be located any longer on the Maverick, but elsewhere in Woodstock, a Colonial Revival house with a stone veneer. That design was never carried out, but this house was built for Carl Walters and Helen at a site similar to the one where the Teller and Halverson house was planned for. And it may in fact have been based on a Teller and Halverson design. At any rate, we again see how the rusticity of the Maverick no longer appealed in the late 30s and into the 40s. When I was studying Walters and the Maverick in 2005, this is what Carl Walters' kiln looked like, actually quite well preserved considering the time that had passed and the weather that had occurred. The shop, the studio, likewise well preserved, thanks to Philip Guston and Philip Guston's family, which currently owns the Carl Walters studio. So thank you very much for your attention.
So now we're going to hear about some of Carl Walters' contemporaries in this resurgence of ceramic arts that took place in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s. Caroline Hanna
Hang on.
is a recent PhD, like within a month?
Well, 6 weeks.
6 weeks, 6 weeks?
No, a month.
From the Bart Graduate Center for the History of the Decorative Arts, Design, and Material Culture on 86th Street, West 86th Street in Manhattan. And she's also recently become a curator there. And she's going to speak about Henry Varnum Poor, one of Walter's major contemporaries.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Sarah and Janice, for organizing today's panel of talks. It's really wonderful to see Carl Walters' ceramics because they've been so elusive through much of my work, but he's someone that I have thought about quite a bit in my work on Poor. Who is Henry Varnum Poor? I suspect maybe he's familiar to some of you, but maybe also to some of you he's a completely new figure. But Poor was in his day, and he started making pottery in in the early 1920s, the same time as Walters. Really became one of the preeminent studio potters in this country. He is kind of known somewhat among studio potters today, but a little bit, maybe they know his work, maybe not. Certainly his name comes up. He's also known among painters, particularly contemporary painters, as one of the founders of the Skowhegan School of painting and sculpture, the residency program in Maine. So, mostly because one of the houses there is the poor house, so people know him there. But he is many things, and he is much more than just a painter and potter. He was trained as an academic painter, and I say academic, I should say first that he became many things during his lifetime too, including one of the leading fresco painters between the war, and really painting in true fresco. And I show you a major work at the top, which is the land grant frescoes in Old Main and at Penn State. And this was a major fresco project, but he had also done major works at the Department of Justice. And sometimes when you see if you ever see footage of the Attorney General or the Solicitor General coming out of their office, those are porous murals right around the doors. And also a major one at the Department of Interior. And while, these works, we kind of put them all together as WPA, he was really working through the Treasury Department with a group called the Section. And these were, established artists as opposed to more of a financial relief program. But this was something, as a painter, he became very much a realist painter in the 30s. But later in life too, he continues this interest in ceramics and mural painting really wonderfully in the 50s. And I show you one of his larger tile murals, which you can still see extant in New York. It's in the Klingenstein Memorial Pavilion at Mount Sinai Hospital, right off Fifth Avenue, right across from Central Park. The theme of this mural. But he was very much trained as a painter. This, an early self-portrait, 1912, currently at Stanford, his alma mater. While Poor made his home in New York, he was not from here at all. He was born in Kansas, right in the middle of the country, and his mother, very curiously, and fortuitously for him, had learned that Leland Stanford University offered free tuition at the time to anyone who was a resident of California. So what did she do? She packed off her 3 teenage kids and moved to Palo Alto and rented a house. And although poor, by this time the family they were not poors. In fact, Henry Varnum Poor was named after a much more famous Henry Varnum Poor, his great uncle, who was the Poor who became one of the founders of what became Standard & Poor, the financial index. So, this branch of the family likes to call themselves the Poors, but in fact they had some relations in New York who were quite the opposite, and much confusion and hilarity when one Henry Varnum Poor was invited to a party and thinking it was the artist and the lawyer showed up, or that sort of thing. But Poor, very much, while he initially studied economics, as you can imagine, and this was the day of Torsten Veblen, if you know, very much influenced that program. And Poor, but he already had a very demonstrated interest in the arts. He was a great drawer in his childhood. He had also studied in Emmanuel Arts High School in Kansas City, which was very important for the work he would do. And at Stanford, he did switch his major, much to his father's consternation, as you can imagine. But he was very determined to make a go of it, worked every summer, was selling, doing commercial arts in college, some poster design, painting the hats for one of the student groups, the Pug Uglies, named after the notorious gang on the East Coast, and doing all kinds of things. But importantly, he did go and study abroad right before graduation. He went abroad with his professor, Clark, and studied and spent a summer touring around by bicycle. Went to Italy, went to, through from London through France, and then to Italy and back up. And then studied in London at the Slade School of Art. And then there he saw a very important exhibition of post-impressionist painting at the Grafton Galleries, where interestingly there were ceramics on view. So you have all of these kinds of pieces in there, but he was very much determined to be a painter. And after a semester in France as well, he received a teaching position at Stanford where he painted this portrait. And you can see possibly somewhat of the influence of Cezanne, who was one of his great idols. But, things change, and after a number of years in California, World War I comes. He goes back to France, and on his return, he decides to move to New York. Well, this is not the New York that you probably imagine, skyscrapers, jazz age in the 20s. Not at all. And this isn't Woodstock either, but this is somewhere in between. He ends up settling quite early after his arrival in late 1919 in Rockland County, if you know the area north of Nyack, South Mountain Road, which was kind of an artist colony of its own, a little bit looser, I would say, less ideological in some ways. Mary Mowbray Clark and her British husband had kind of she owned a bookstore in New York City called the Sunwise Turn, and really ran a kind of a salon there. A number of writers, artists, all kinds of avant-garde assembled there, and then often they were invited up to their weekend house, which is an old Dutch colonial house, and they really stayed in lean-tos. Well, a number of people decided to stay and build houses, and Poor and his then wife, Marion Dorn, were two of them. And here he is building his house, Crow House, very much by hand. He's using this local sandstone that's in a quarry on the property, hauling it. I love the picture of the automobile in Bill Rhodes, because none of this would have been possible if they didn't have transportation. They were still very much connected to the city, but choosing to live in a different way, more connected to the land, more of the simple life. And you can see the wood, too, he sources from the land. These are the American chestnuts that had just been blighted, and, we're still standing, so he uses that to frame the doorways. And here you can see an early picture of the house, and you can see his painting studio, the large windows, and then possibly his pottery studio just behind that. I think I'm doing it now too, whatever's going on. But what you can't see in this angle, you can see kind of the steeply pitched roof, but you can't see that protruding from that is the kitchen, and over that is just a flat concrete roof. Every room opens up to the outside, a bit of California living, I suppose. The windows, doors on either side of the chimney, very much showing that they really did want to live connected to the land. And here is Crow House as it stands today. A few more extensions, including the tower that you see in the background. But very much, a home of an artist and someone who was not trained as an architect, but still, inspired, I think, in part by his grandfather, who had built his own stone house on the Kansas prairie. But here you can see that great fireplace, the massive chestnut beam holding up the ceiling, and several pieces of furniture that he carved himself. So really creating his own environment. Pieces of ceramics, including a lamp, and also a mix of antiques. I mean, I think, we say antiques, but this was really country furniture to them. Another view of the living room showing this wonderful stone staircase and how it just, stops right before the landing above. And ceramics abound in this house. You can see the Chimney Medallion, which really has an almost kind of German expressionist feel with the emblem of the crow arching over the house, which became his first pottery mark. It also has his name and the date of the house, 1920-21, and the date of his second wife, Marion Dorn, who became a textile designer in her own right. But these are very early ceramics. And these are somewhat later, but showing more of an Art Deco vibe, particularly in the fireplace, but also in the lamp, the ceiling fixture, which has a glass cylinder by Maurice Heaton. But Crow House really becomes a site of experimentation. And for Poor, he came to ceramics almost, really as a money maker. He writes very clearly to his friend in Kansas, the artist Berger Sanson, that I'm going to start making pottery. This is in February 1921. In part, so I can give up teaching. He was teaching at Stanford and at the Art Institute in San Francisco. But also to just give us, a more connected way of living and a more, more vitally. He was looking for a way of making art that was more vital to him than painting had become at this moment. One of the great features of Crow House is this ceramic bathroom, which is still standing there, which he created in 1928 for the American Designers Gallery, which I'll talk to you about. But it really shows kind of this influence of his painting skills. You can see the almost Matissean nude in the shower stall. This is as it was installed in the family bathroom, right? And here, this is, getting closer to industrial ceramics, although, he molded the, kind of relief tiles in the shower so you wouldn't slip. Many of these, and also this faceted sink pedestal. These pieces couldn't be fired at Crow House. His kilns were just Revelation kilns, too small, but he did take them to Trenton and fired them there at the Maddox Pottery. But his real breakout moment came, Poor started with kind of almost an arts and crafts kind of ideal of, making pottery, that could be purchased by lots of people, a very democratic ideal. And he did initially sell at Wanamaker's and what was then known as the Belmoson Gallery. But here we have, and that, that's kind of unknown exactly when he did that. He started making pottery in 21, 22, probably sold to the Belmoson. But he couldn't keep up with the production order. He was a one-person operation and continued to be that. But it was in late 1922 that he, probably through Mary Mowbray Clark, was given a one-person show at the Montrose Gallery in New York. And this was a real opportunity to show at a major gallery. This was a gallery that had the first major exhibition of Matisse and also Van Gogh. And it was, a show that, there's document that, Stieglitz and Georgia O'Keeffe came to, and they were really, putting his work out there as kind of modern art. And this is the kind of pottery he was doing then. This is a piece that was purchased the week before the show opened, as I was able to find in my research, by the Metropolitan Museum and went into the collection. But you can see in his little pamphlet that he created, he was talking about the method of the old Persians, and that was slip-decorated pottery. So what you can almost see in the background, red earthenware with a cream slip over it, and then he paints with mineral colors over that, and then it's a lead glaze firing. So very old techniques, but a very modern kind of imagery with this woman, with her short hair, a very kind of relaxed pose, but a very, very kind of strong image. And here, I think Martin will recognize this plate. another early work, probably from about 1924, really showing the influence of European painting, modern painting in his ceramic work. And it finds an audience. It's being collected by museums, it's being collected by people in New York. And he shifts his style, he's very much, while Walters is oriented towards sculpture, Poor is really more oriented towards painting, as I think they show you. But when you look at the piece from 1931, you can see it's really, painters probably, it doesn't really tell the whole story. He really is a draftsman. When you look at the kind of fine line of the way he sculpted the coffee pot there, and even, the line goes right through the bowl of plums, and that's no problem. But that is really, I think, what his greatest skill is. And he's also working in a different technique. This is, of course, sgraffito, scratching in through the slip, the cross-hatching, very close to printmaking, to get a very different kind of line. And of course, he's looking too at, he's looking at a great many things. He's looking at, this is really combining the sgraffito technique within the border, but also the finer lines of Ben Hecht. You see these you see portrait plates in the Renaissance with the belladonnas, but here we have the screenwriter Ben Hecht instead of, a woman. And then you see a plate like this, which has a very abstract, almost cubist pattern, scratched through the slip. And you can see, and it's also a drape-formed platter. And you really start to understand that he's really looking at American ceramics tradition, particularly by the 30s. They showed together, while Poor didn't show at Via, he did do a ceramic tile that's near the doorway for that gallery. He does have extant architectural ceramics in New York City, animals again. And he also did increasingly major architectural commissions here for the Shelton Hotel, a tile mural, which was, the interior was destroyed, and particularly here for the Union Dime Savings Bank, which doesn't exist any longer, but you can see how his medallions fit into the corners of these spandrels in this Byzantine kind of style. But again, animals, they're there. And that this was, fit into these various idioms. It is funny to read the Times reviews of these because, even these were just things that he had, that's the family dog. Apparently the architect's infant child was in another spandrel. So he really took, very personal imagery and had no problem putting it into other places. This is details from a bathroom, again showing his love for animals, but here coming out of research, visits to the Everglades and creating this very naturalistic sensibility. Okay. And his bathroom again in 1928, just to give you a sense. Ceramic sculpture does creep in. Here in the wonderful pierced Radiator cover. Wouldn't you love to have one of those in your home or apartment? But you can see his vessels too, a little bit wonky, and I was happy to see the Harvey White bowl in its sort of lopsidedness. And here, I think it's hard, when you think of Poor, he was moving in so many directions. By 32, Radio City Music Hall, which we think about for its mural decoration, Poor would have loved to have done a mural. Instead, he was commissioned by Dorsky, his friend from the American Designers Gallery, to do lamps and vases. But he also did sculptural works. Now, this shows up in a publicity still from the penthouse apartment at Radio City. This is for Roxy, Samuel Rothaffel's apartment. We don't really know that it was commissioned for that. In fact, this piece stayed in the family for a great many years. And But here it is, and this is the Romeo and Juliet. There's another view. You can see the little figure. He had a great sense of humor and I think a real love of ceramics. So it fits in with many of his plates and tiles. And then there, his one large major work is this Leda the Swan, which was for Helen Hayes and Charles MacArthur in Nyack. And one of these maquettes is in the show. And then here is that sculptural tile, which is in the Mint Museum now, but it's was made for, it's whether it was made for, but a version of it appears in the what was known as the Poker House, a writing cabin for Ben Hecht here, and that is a design, architectural design, a whole another realm. So I'll end here just to say that Poor was so many things: a designer of houses, a designer of ceramics. These are some of the features for a Maxwell Anderson house. And so many, much of his sculpture, comes out of these relationships that he had with many of these people in his community, in the arts. And its community, I mean, not just on South Mountain Road, but in New York, Hollywood, the wider. And it's been wonderful to kind of think of him and Carl Walters in context, because they do have so many points in common. And thank you.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. And our final presenter will be Tom Folk, who has a PhD. He's a certified appraiser from the Appraisers Association of America, and he's going to speak about another important ceramic sculptor from contemporary with Carl Walters, Weiland Gregory, about whom he's already written and published the definitive book.
Thank you. How do I get forward? This is forward?
And that's back.
And backward. Okay, thank you. I think this Carl Walters show is way overdue, so I'm glad it finally happened in my lifetime, so thank you. Okay, now moving on, I'm talking about Weiland Gregory, who's a major ceramic sculptor. What is important about Gregory, I want you to think about, he's the first major creator of monumental ceramic sculpture in modern times. And I think you have to look beyond American art, because American art is really geared towards more stone and bronze sculpture. But in the 30s, there's a major change with ceramic sculpture. He's the first one in Western art, not just American art, to do monumental ceramic sculptures. This is still extant. It's in Washington, D.C., and it is the police and firemen. This is a WPA mural, one of the last things from the WPA, 1941, and it's still there today. And like this. Okay, this is a maquette for it, means a study for it. And it got a lot of attention because it dealt with the subject of police brutality to black people, to black men. And so this shows policemen beating up on black men. It's still a problem today. Nothing's much changed since 1941. But it was in the press at the time. And Paul Manship, his friend, major bronze sculptor who did Prometheus in Rockefeller Center, defended Gregory, saying that he was a great ceramic sculptor, that Gregory knew he was. But he wanted to do monumental. Now this one here, this is the largest ceramic relief in the world at the time, and it was 81 feet long. So this is part of monumental. Now the things that Gregory liked a lot were two things. He started getting interested in ceramics in 1928. He went to Italy. He went around Europe, but he stayed more time in Italy than anywhere else. And he liked two things. He liked Della Robbia's work. Della Robbia was one of the founders of the early Renaissance. And he did relief work. Della Robbia didn't really do too much in freestanding ceramic sculpture. This is the Resurrection from Florence Cathedral. And it uses a tin glaze, which means that it's good for weather. So it could get weathered on. This is a tympanum from Florence Cathedral. He did two of them. And this one is 1446. So very influential on Weiland Gregory, but his is much bigger than he talks about Della Robbia. So from the past, probably Della Robbia is the most important influence on Gregory, also the ancient Etruscans. So in Tuscany, he saw both. That's where he stayed. He stayed in Tuscany, the area between Rome and Florence, and he saw the Etruscan work and Della Robbia's work. Now, Carl Walters. I own this piece, and I've been collecting ceramics since 1980. The first important piece I bought was an auction at Sotheby's, and Martin Eidelberg was the underbidder, actually. He told me I wouldn't get it. It would go too high, and that's the worst thing to tell me. You'll never get it. So I bid on it, and I figured out how to pay for it afterwards, you know? So anyway, so I got involved. I bought this at Sotheby's in the early 80s at another auction. So this is in the Whitney, the same mold. Carl Walters used ceramic molds, but he made them unique by the way he decorated them, this kind of calligraphic kind of decoration. And this is the kind of blue glaze I'm sure Tom's going to tell you about, is Egyptian blue. That's what he invented, this Egyptian blue glaze he got from the hippopotamus in the Metropolitan Museum. So this is Stallion, and it's very early. This is one of his first, Carl Walters' first ceramic sculptures, 1922, when he first started doing these things. So today I'm going to talk about basically three different things. The Whitney Museum, which is important to both Gregory and Carl Walters, animals, which are important to both, and a discussion of two dogs. But most people like dogs. So Weiland Gregory was from the Midwest. He was from Kansas, and he was lucky to study with Lorado Taft, who was a major teacher in American sculpture of students. And he was a major figure in the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. And he had two, before Gregory, his most famous protege students were Bessie Padovano and Janet Scudder. So he liked to work with female students. He was gay, but he liked to work with female students, and he produced some very important women sculptors. But towards the end of his life, he had Weiland Gregory, who was supposed to stay with him for 18 months, stayed with him for 3 years. This is his famous Midway Studios in Chicago. And this is Weiland Gregory. He's a young man in his early 20s, maybe he's just 20 years old, in Lorado Taft's studio. And his most famous sculpture from the past is the Pietà by Michelangelo, which you see there. But surrounding him are Weiland Gregory corbels that he designed for the seminary in Chicago. So he was very young, very ambitious, and studying with one of the major teachers of American sculpture really helped him a lot. Now, Carl Walters and Henry Vernon Poor were painters, but if you're going to do monumental ceramic sculpture, it really helps to study with a major sculptor rather than with a major painter, and that's what he did. So he got interested in ceramics, went to Italy with Lorado Taft in 1928. And this is Lorado Taft. This is the Fountain of Time, and fountains are a very important subject for Weiland Gregory. This one is 1920, and it's 126 feet long. And it's made out of a concrete aggregate, and it's still there in Chicago in the Midway, near Taft's studio. So from Taft, he got the idea of making ceramics enormous. This is his first major piece of Salome. And there's a lot of versions of Salome in Western art. This one relates to the opera, though. This relates to Richard Strauss's opera. And it's Salome, as you probably know, is a student of a Jewish princess who wanted to get ahead. Ba-bum. And here she is with the head of St. John. And at the end of the opera there, the music pressed. There's a crescendo there. And you could see the wave of the music at the bottom. You know, her wicked triumph when she finally gets the head of St. John, you know, this wicked, perverted victory that she has. And she dies right after that. She gets murdered by her father, has the soldiers murder her. But this is a very rare piece today. There are only 3 known. And I'm going to praise it, but I have no idea what this is worth because there's only 3 of them in the world. So it was a limited edition at Cowan. And Cowan had the idea of promoting ceramic sculpture. Not only Carl Walters, but also Guy Cowan. And he began to put pieces at places like the Pennsylvania Academy in Philadelphia, where these were seen as sculpture, not as, you know, tea sets, but as serious ceramic sculpture. So working there was important. Gregory always felt at Cowan that he had to design, quote, for other people's taste. You know, they had to sell the stuff. It just wasn't his taste. It was made to sell. So that's his first major piece there. He was noted for his females. He did the best female nudes in 20th century American ceramics. His nudes, female nudes are great. I want to talk about animals. Carl Walters loved fish. And these are prototypes for Cowan pottery for fish candlesticks, flying fish candlesticks that Gregory designed. These are porcelain. And the ones they produced are green earthenware with green glazes, which are much cruder than these. And you needed really, making porcelain is very hard to do it on your own. But if you have a factory like Cowan doing it for you, that really helps a lot. So these are the only pair I know of these. These were in Gregory's estate. And they're beautiful translucent porcelain. But he loved animals, and so did Carl Walters. So they have that in common. And also he did, now these as far as I know are unique. These are maquettes for squirrel bookends, which are very Art Deco. These are 1930, they're signed and dated. And he never put these into production at Cowan. Why that is, I don't know. But these are the only pair known of these, so they're very rare today. And also, now this is not a limited edition. This one is mass produced. So this is probably the cheapest animal sculpture today. And this is for a console set. And flamingos, you think of Florida. A lot of these wound up in Florida. But the first ceramic sculpture, the first time you really see flamingo in ceramics, like ceramic sculptures, at the Cavalier Hotel in Miami in the early 40s. Well, this one is from 1930, so Weiland Gregory was way ahead of the trend for liking flamingos for Florida hotels. So he loved exotic birds, and he did a lot of birds. Carl Walters didn't do too many birds. He did a penguin that was exhibited at the Whitney. He also did a duck. But I think that Weiland Gregory liked birds better than Carl Walters. Now, a story of two dogs. This is a very rare Cowan design. It's a limited edition, supposed to be 50, but I don't think they even made 10 of these. It probably wasn't that popular, you know, when it came out at Cowan. So it's extremely rare today. So this is his sculpture from 1931. This is called Beaten Dog. And he wrote an article about this sculpture in, in 1960. And he described what happened with the sculpture. And Weiland Gregory wrote, "The little dog was cowering on the highway where it had been cast aside and lost. I brought it home to the studio to nurse it back to health and wrapped it in a warm towel by the fire. Hunched up there, afraid and grateful, it feebly kissed my hand and touched my heart. It seemed to represent to me all the loneliness and despair, the poor, the miserable and homeless of the world, and the epitome of rejection and the tragedy of life. The dog had no proud pedigree bearing, not even a collar or license. It was just a plain, nondescript, homeless dog that somehow came into being in the mystery of this world. It was suffering, and I could help it. And it occurred to me that I could do more. I would sculpt it in its humility and praise it as a living thing, a creature of feeling and suffering, and capable of gratitude, joy, and love. As it later proved abundantly as it recovered and had a happy life. So I sculpted a little beaten, outcast dog, just as it shivered by the fire, cold, wet, and miserable. And if I had sculpted the finest champion of the kennels, or the king of the dog shows, the sculpted piece could not have been more gratifying or successful. Stray Pup Struggles into Immortality was the name of his article from, and it won a prize at the Cleveland Museum in 1931. So that's Gregory's dog, kind of humanistic, a kind of pathetic dog. That's very rare today. Now compare that to Carl Walters' dog. Oh, there's Weiland Gregory and a dog. So he truly never had any children. So him and his wife truly liked animals. There were all kind of animals at his house in New Jersey. And this is Carl Walters' dog. I could tell you a story about this dog too. I own this one. I didn't own the other one. I own this one. And I've owned it also since the early 80s. It's 1938. And I did research on a painter named Charles Rosen. who was a New Hope painter, and I did an exhibition on his New Hope paintings, which were impressionistic. He moved to Woodstock in 1920. He lived next to George Bellows and Spiker, Eugene Spiker. And when I was doing research in the 1980s, I visited Charles Rosen's daughter, his name was Mrs. Warner. And she told me this was their dog, Charles Rosen's dog, and her name was Martha Muffin. And she wrote a note about this, and that was her name. So this is Portrait of Martha Muffin. And it's not pathetic like Weiland Gregory's dog. This one is playful and happy. And this one has wonderful use. I love when artists, painters, sculptors do animal stripes and spots. They're so modernistic. So I like the way he has like clusters of spots on this animal in a very modern way. I like the reduction of the shape, which kind of goes back higher in the back. So it has a very modern, almost Eli Nadelman kind of look. It's really, Carl Walter's animals are really terrific. And then this one is his most famous piece. This is Kansas Madonna, which was on the cover. Henry Fonda tried to buy this from Weiland Gregory for me in Kansas. Horses are a major subject by Weiland Gregory. And also this idea of religion. You know, this is about really Grant Wood's American Gothic. You have the Gothic plate glass window, which is hardly like the windows in France. So it's a play on religion. And this is in the show. This is his Cranbrook deer, which he did in 1932, and very rare today. And he did monumental sculptures. This one was exhibited at the Whitney. This was his swimmer. And Henry McBride, the critic, said it looked like it was made for the outside of a Miami hotel. But the big point was ceramics are no longer something in a cabinet. This is an outside sculpture that was huge. This is a huge one he did, was exhibited at the Whitney. And Carl Walters exhibited 18 works at the Whitney. Weiland Gregory exhibited 4. And this one is 72 inches. It's been donated by Gregory's estate to Alfred. If you go to the museum, it's the center of the new museum, ceramic museum at Alfred. It weighs 2,000 pounds. Wow. Cost them $5,000 to get it from New Jersey to upstate New York. And this is the back. In front of it was made for the front of the Philadelphia Museum. So here it is on display outdoors at the Philadelphia Museum. And Cranbrook has this one, and this was for his most famous thing was the Fountain of the Atom, 1939 World's Fair. This one is also 2,000 pounds at Cranbrook today. And this is his Fountain of the Atom from the World's Fair in 1939, which has, the upper tier has 2,000 pound sculptures, 4 of them, and the lower level are 8 smaller ones. And this is one of the electrons that are around the base. So that's it for today. Sorry I couldn't talk more, but thank you.